So the challenge was to come up with something that wouldn't make the microphone go funny, that was different from my day job. So I wanted to take a step back and look at where the sources of innovation are coming from that are going to lead us to the 5G world or whatever world it is that we're going to get to. And I also wanted to make it provocative. So as you'll gather, the thesis here is that innovation is moving away from the large research entities and large companies. Do you want to have a go at it? Thank you. To smaller organisations, and I know that many of you here represent large companies, so hopefully this will engender some discussion at the end of the talk. So the first thing to do is then to look at what do I mean when I talk about innovation. What is it that I'm trying to get at in terms of new ideas? And the best definition I came across of innovation was one from a UK organisation called the Technology Strategy Board. And it defines innovation as the successful exploitation of new ideas. And I think there's two key parts in that. One is new ideas, but the other is successful exploitation. So new ideas is invention, and then the innovation element is turning them into something that is actually successful. And innovation has become a buzzword of our age. Almost every politician at some point talks about furthering innovation. Regulators talk all the time about more innovation. It's a bit like motherhood and apple pie, and hence the picture. You know, how can it possibly be a bad thing? Everyone just says innovation, and everyone assumes that innovation is great. Is it always great? Well, I think a bit less innovation in the financial world might not have been a bad thing. I'm not sure I want to be on board the most innovative airplane ever when it takes its first flight. So there are some times where it's not a good thing. But I think in our case, it is a good thing. We do need some innovation in the world of telecommunications to continue to come up with new ideas to meet the challenges we've heard about today. Just in passing, we tend to think of innovation as things. We tend to think of the iPad. Here's an innovative new concept. But actually, many of the best innovations are in processes rather than in things. So the production line was a fantastic innovation. It wasn't a thing, it was a process. And actually, most of our world today is made up of services. So most of our world is actually process rather than things. So many of the key innovations of our time will actually be service innovations rather than process innovations. So when we think of innovation, we often think of some of the great advances of the last few decades. And in the world of telecoms, I think perhaps up there amongst the leading stars of innovation in the past is Bell Labs. And I know we have people here from Bell Labs, so well done. And you can see there the list of the fantastic list of things that Bell Labs has come up with, from the transistor through to the C++ programming language, the 7 Nobel Prizes. Clearly, Bell Labs has been an incredible source of innovation over the last 50 years or so, and has driven many of the underlying things that have changed our world. So is Bell Labs the right model for innovation going forwards? Well, you'll gather from my title that I don't think it is, and I'll come round to why that is towards the end of the talk. So if not Bell Labs, how about this guy? If you had to pick somebody who seems to have been the most innovative over the last 20 years, then Steve Jobs would be way up there, I think. As we look around at the iPhone, the iPod, the iPad, the whole of the area of Mac, Steve Jobs seemed to have some wonderful, magical ability to come up with new concepts that struck a chord and changed the way we do things. Of course, he wasn't perfect. He came up with a number of computer systems that didn't work so well. But generally, most of the things he touched were pretty successful. And I've said Steve Jobs rather than Apple, because I personally think it was Steve Jobs rather than Apple. Now, time will tell, of course, but certainly since Steve Jobs has left Apple, they have not launched anything new apart from smaller versions of the same things they've been doing before, or cheaper versions of the same thing they've been doing before. So it does seem to me it was more about a person than a company in that particular case. But one of my key observations is that it's very hard to come up with something formulaic to do things differently. And I'm going to divert here to an interesting interlude in the world of economics. And if there are any economists here, they'll probably shoot me for this because I'm not, and I suspect I've not got the details anywhere near right. But the principles, I think, are fine. So there's a fairly famous economist called Goodhart. There he is. And some time ago, he came up with a wonderful law of economics that essentially said, if there was if you made some observation about a relationship between two monetary variables, like say the amount of monetary supply and growth in the economy or something like that, and if the government then targeted one of those variables as a matter of government policy, that relationship would break down. And the reason it would break down would be because the behavioral factors that made the relationship work in the first place would change once the government started to use that variable as a way to change things, because people would then predict that the government would do certain things, that would give a certain outcome, and they would act in such a way as to profit from it. And it seems to me actually much of that applies across much of economics, in fact. Of course, economic laws are not laws at all, they're merely observations of human behavior. And so if you publicize something, the stock market always goes up on a Monday, what happens? Well, people start buying on a Friday night in order to gain from the Monday, and then it goes up on Friday, and the whole thing just breaks down because immediately you have some kind of observed correlation. There's a rationale for using that in a way that causes the underlying laws to break down. And I think we also see this if we look back in history in terms of companies. So, very famous book, In Search of Excellence. And it charted a number of US companies, mostly US companies, that seemed to be doing things extraordinarily well, and it said why they were doing this stuff so well. If you fast forward 20 years or so since it was published, virtually none of those companies exist anymore, and certainly none of them are in the top companies. So what happened? Were they doing the wrong things? Or were they copied by others? Or in fact, did times change and the things they were doing not change with the changing times? And I suspect there's an element of all of that. But what I'm trying to paint here is a picture of any kind of a formula is only good for a short period of time. And then you need to do things differently again because the world changes, people change, people try and copy. And as soon as people try and copy, of course, you're not being innovative anymore. So you do need to keep things changing. So if you need to keep things changing, what's changing out there that you can use to coalesce around, or at least as some kind of focus for where you're going? Well, one of my first observations is I think innovation is increasingly coming from people rather than organizations. So I put up that early slide, Bell Labs is the source of all this wonderful innovation. But even, of course, within Bell Labs, it's one person who comes up with the original idea. It may then be a team that works around that. But ideas have to come from a person. A company can't generate ideas. It's not a living thing. In the past, that individual innovation was masked by companies because they tended to not make a big thing about the person. Instead, it was here's an idea that's come out of Samsung or whatever. You don't know who the person behind it was unless you were deeply involved in it. But the world has changed, and we've seen Steve Jobs, and you may recognize James Dyson there. Clear, leading individuals who've had the ideas and the innovation and then brought teams in around them to make that work. So it seems to me that we are in a world where individuals matter now more than they do in the past. And that's helped by tools such as LinkedIn and other such things as that, which means that as an individual, you can surround yourself with other people or be in contact with other people and other things in a way that was much harder before. One other observation on this slide is, which I'll come back to, is innovation typically occurs in response to a problem. It's rare to be sat in the bath and suddenly think of something brand new that nobody ever thought of before. What tends to happen is you tend to be looking at something and saying, that doesn't work very well. I wonder if I can make it work better. Or data's going to be going up extraordinarily fast. I wonder how we can solve that problem. So innovation is typically a solution to a problem. In Dyson's case, of course, it was this vacuum cleaner doesn't work very well. I wonder if I can make one that works better. Now we're starting to get onto the more controversial side of things. Startups generate most ideas. Is that really true? Well, I judge the Wall Street Journal's Innovation Awards each year. There are something like 1,000 entries, I think, each year across a wide range of categories in that. And in 2012, which was the last year it was run, I took a look at all the entries and tried to categorize them. And it's not always that easy, but I did my best. 65% of all the entries were from SMEs. 85% of all the winners were SMEs. So that's the sort of evidence I offer to suggest that actually it is startups that are generating the most ideas. Why is that? Well, I think partly it's because there's less corporate R&D. Certainly in the world of telecoms, we've seen R&D organizations shrink rather than grow over the last 10 years as times get tougher for companies. It's also, I think, because people recognize it is really, really tough to get ideas out of corporate labs and into the real world. And I worked for Motorola for 3 years, and for 2 of those years, I was trying to do just that. And I was working with VCs and spin-out organizations and spin-in organizations and all sorts of strange vehicles for trying to improve the gap between the point where the R&D labs typically want to drop something when it's perhaps 5 to 10 years from realization, and the point where the actual development organizations want to pick it up, which is when it's typically a couple of years away from development. The other thing that's changed as well is sooner or later as a startup you need to grow up, particularly if you're going to do something big, and that either means getting a lot more funding, or it often means getting acquired by a large company that can then take you forward into sort of the next step. And that's the classic example of that for our time perhaps is Android. That was a startup acquired by by Google, who then managed to drive it with both the mix of funding that they had and of course the name brand, which added a lot to it to take it forwards. And the whole area of acquiring startups has become much, much better since Cisco took a look at it perhaps some 15 years ago now and worked out ways to do it without disrupting the culture and the ecosystem of the organization. Before then, typically it was death to a startup to be acquired by a large company. You got hit by the company bureaucracy, everyone left, and that was the end of that. So startups have got a lot of things that have changed in the last 10 years that make it easier for them to succeed, and indeed make it harder for the large organizations to succeed. Another one of those is the internet. So in the past, one of the big problems for small companies was getting their message out. How are they going to market themselves? What sales channels were they going to use, particularly if they were going to try and sell to consumers? That was a really tough one, but even selling to businesses, that was tough. How are they going to spread their ideas and get people to hear about them? And those all required in the past a lot of expenditure, expertise, care and attention. But that, of course, has changed dramatically now. And the example here of Angry Birds is a product from a startup that went from nothing to global success in a few months on the back of almost no marketing or sales channels or anything. The internet really does change everything in the way that startups can market themselves, develop their ideas, sell their products even, of course, directly through the internet. It changes the whole rationale for being small and being big. The other thing to look at if you want to innovate is where are the problems that are the most pressing and will attract the most funding. And going through the Wall Street Journal list, I came up with those 4 areas. Healthcare, of course, an enormous problem for our time in so many different areas, both specific medicines and specific problems, but also generally how we can afford it. The whole issue of security has been hot ever since 9/11, but we continually see the Boston bombings and so on. All of that leads to requirements for better security. Energy, of course, we've heard about that this morning, the need for saving energy. And the cloud might not sound like a problem, it might sound like an opportunity, but of course it also raises problems, often around IT security, reliability, ways to port existing systems into cloud-like systems, which leads to a lot of invention. But I have to say, unfortunately, from looking at the Wall Street Journal, that the vast majority of ideas are what I call very incremental. I suppose they are slightly innovative, but they're just a tiny tweak on something. Only about 2 or 3 of the entries out of the 1,000 are what I call truly radical, groundbreaking inventions. Most innovation is just a little step further forward. And maybe that's right, maybe that's the way it should be. Too many big leaps can be pretty destabilizing. Do you need somewhere to innovate? It's tempting to think you don't. The internet means you can sit at home and innovate. I think you do. I think you need to be in a cluster. And the reason for that is because clusters allow you to bring together people that you need for your company or to discuss things, bounce ideas off. they're a hotbed of individuals all in the same location that you can conference with, meet with, bring together into a company very quickly. Also, you tend to find the funding sources are clustered around the same kind of places. And the sort of support organisations you need. So, for example, in Cambridge, where I'm based, there's Cambridge Wireless, Cambridge Networking, a number of groups that are there just to bring together people and allow them to exchange ideas and grow. The other thing is that you tend to bring together people who've done this before. And one thing you observe with the startup is the dramatic change in success rate if you've got somebody with some experience. Startup success rates are typically about 10%, as in about 10% of startups actually have some kind of an exit rather than just failing completely and disappearing. But bring in people who've done it before, and that success rate leaps up to about 30%. Still might sound quite low to a company, to a larger company, but of course that's the way startups work. You have a few stunning successes and a lot of minor failures. Innovating in telecoms, I think, in some cases is particularly tough. And it's particularly tough where you are trying to innovate with some new kind of system, wireless link, fixed link, or whatever. So the problem there is what I call the two ends problem. If you go back to the early days of Bluetooth, there was no rationale for me to buy a device with Bluetooth in when I had no other Bluetooth devices. What was it going to connect to? But then there's no point buying any other Bluetooth devices if I haven't got the first Bluetooth device. And you get the chicken and egg problem of until there's two ends of the system out there, there's no point in having one end. So someone has got to feed the system to get the first end in place. And in the case of Bluetooth, that was Ericsson and Nokia, who just kept putting it into mobile phones for years, despite the fact it had nothing to talk to. And probably the first generation of Bluetooth phones, the Bluetooth never got turned on. But it got things going and eventually sparked other people to think, gosh, I could produce a wireless headset that has Bluetooth. And then suddenly it started to make sense for individuals, and then it took off. So you've got this kind of two ends problem. You've got regulatory issues. Certainly if you want to access radio spectrum, there's regulation. But typically there's a lot of other regulation around telecoms, from universal service provision to interconnect agreements to pricing agreements to must carry arrangements and so on, that may come to bite. Potential barriers to entry, lack of spectrum, other such things. Domination by mobile operators, particularly in the world of cellular, of course. Very hard to do anything without them agreeing to it. If you wanted to introduce a new handset and none of the cellular operators liked it very much, that would make your life very, very tough. Try getting Skype into the world of mobile without any of the mobile operators wanting it. That kind of thing would be very, very difficult to do. And of course, lots of government intervention. So I'm going to turn very briefly to what I'm actually doing now, and how that plays into this whole innovation space. So the company I'm with now is developing a new standard for wireless machine-to-machine communications. And the idea of that standard is really to hit what we think are the three key requirements for machine communications, which is very low cost, so less than $2 for a complete radio module. 10-year battery life, because a lot of this stuff goes into trash cans, car park spaces, whatever. You don't want to have to ever change the battery. And a range of big enough that you can have really ubiquitous coverage even indoors, which typically means about 5 kilometers, something like that, allows you to achieve that. So the key driver for this was actually a change in regulation, which was a piece of radio spectrum called the TV whitespace spectrum, which is working in and around the TV bands. And that was the enabler that really made the whole thing happen. And as an interesting side point, it's been the US and the UK that have been pioneering the use of whitespace. And if you look at, as far as I'm aware, all the companies with some kind of whitespace product, be that a radio or a database or something else, they are all either US or UK companies. And that's interesting because there's no reason for that. There's nothing to stop a French company developing a whitespace product and selling it into the US or the UK. But actually, if you're in the country, first of all, you tend to notice the regulatory change first. And the fact that you're there and you can do trials and so on without having to travel makes life easier. So there seems to be something about a regulator being able to allow more innovation in their company by being innovative themselves in regulatory policy, which I think is a bit of a wake-up call for many regulators who are far from innovative in any kind of policy. Now, I'm the CTO of Waitlist, so to say the technical bit is simple might seem like I'm doing myself out of a job. I think actually get enough good engineers in a room and you can solve most technical problems. That's not particularly challenging, even if it takes time and skill. It can be done. And I think if you look at most of the problems facing the world of telecoms and probably the wider world, they're actually not really technical problems. We could probably solve the technology fairly easily. They're problems around all sorts of other things like regulation, spectrum access, IPR policy, dominance of certain companies, global agendas, those kind of things. The next thing that we needed to do with Waitlist was to overcome the two-end problem by making it an open standard. If it's not an open standard, you don't get people producing both sides of it. Actually, if it's not an open standard, it doesn't become successful. And Jens this morning showed a number of dominant technologies, and things become dominant when they become the main global standard. I don't think there are any wireless technologies out here at the moment that are successful that are not global standards. It's just the way things are in wireless. So Waitlist needed to be an open standard. But the problem we have now is standards bodies, particularly ETSI and the IEEE, are rather slow and can be dominated by infighting between different interested parties who are all trying to get their own particular IPR embedded into a standard. And that can lead to huge delays, and we saw that with things like ultra-wideband, where the IEEE eventually gave up and it fragmented into user bodies and so on. So in Waitlist, we decided to go down the Bluetooth route, which is to set up a new standards organization purely for the purpose of standardizing one technology. It's exactly what Bluetooth did with the Bluetooth SIG. It worked very well because it can focus, it doesn't have the bureaucracy, it delivers something very precise. And you can see that with the waitlist.org website. You'll find out more about what we're doing with the Waitlist standard there. Next, we have problems with the mobile operators. Mobile operators, there are a few here, I'm sorry about this, but you're not very innovative, and you're terrible at introducing new ideas. So you've done voice and you've done data, and you failed with picture messaging, group calling, walled garden internet, location-based services, and I could go on and on and on. It's a classic of large companies. They're very good at delivering what they're good at delivering, but when they try and broaden that reach, it tends to go wrong. And at the moment, mobile operators believe they can deliver machine communications the way they can deliver everything else, and unfortunately can't, but it'll take them a while to realize that. Okay, so it's time to start wrapping up. So what have I, in my rather meandering fashion, told you about innovation so far? Well, none of this will surprise you. Take an individual with the right personal characteristics, and that's all of those, not just one of those. Put them in the right kind of community, in particular a cluster where they can be exposed to issues. Pick something that's hard but not too hard, and that's a very difficult balancing act. And use communications, the internet especially, very effectively right from the start. And I would say it's more important to get on board a really excellent PR individual than it is to get on board a really excellent technical individual. That's perhaps slightly controversial. Okay, so you're going to say, that's fine, we knew all that already. What's different? So I don't think innovation anymore is about large companies, apart from perhaps Apple, but even that I think is passing. I think it's about small companies that might then be acquired by larger companies, but I don't think the innovation is going to happen in the larger companies. I think, as I said before, it's much about PR as engineering. The locality is important, both the cluster and national regulation in telecoms cases where it can make a big difference, the white space spectrum being one of the examples in this particular place. And engineering skills clearly are necessary, but are far from critical. we could have hired many more really skilled RF designers and systems designers than we actually needed. That wasn't the problem in getting our company off the ground. And Bell Labs? Well, Bell Labs, unfortunately, is a shadow of its former self. In July 2008, they only had 4 scientists left in physics and basic research. By the end of 2008, it had pulled out of all basic research, material physics, semiconductor research, to focus on more immediately marketable areas. That doesn't sound like research to me. And who knows where it's going, but at the moment, Alcatel-Lucent is not the healthiest of companies. Its new CEO is renowned for cost-cutting and so on. Let's hope for the best, but I'm not certain that Bell Labs is going to be the innovation hothouse going forwards. I'm not picking particularly on Bell Labs here. I think the same is true of most research organizations in most large telecommunications companies. I can't see any that are growing rapidly or focusing more and more on longer term research. So here's my answer to how to be innovative. To be innovative, you have to innovate. That might sound like a really stupid thing to say, but I think you can't have a formula for innovation. By its very nature, it's not formulaic. If there was a formula, everyone would copy it, and then you wouldn't be innovating anymore. You'd simply be doing what everyone else is doing. If you want to be different, you have to be different in everything, not just in your idea, but in the way that you come up with your idea, the way you apply your idea, and the way that you take it forward into the world. And we see that with some of the best innovations. They're not just product innovations, they're process innovations, they're ideas innovations. They bring together different ecosystems. Now, the iPhone was a great innovation, not just because of the software within it, but because of the App Store concept that drove things forwards. Actually, the iPhone without the App Store would be a shadow of its former self. It wasn't just, let's make a better phone, it was let's make a better overall solution. And I will leave it there. Hopefully I've not managed to irritate every single person in this room, but I'm sorry if I have.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Chilin?
Okay. I do have a dear friend, Renato, here, who is still a member of Bell Labs. Okay. And I used to be a member of Bell Labs. We were in the same organization, the wireless research. So while we also lament the trend and the reality of what happened to Bell Labs, it did lay the foundation of ICT industry.
Absolutely.
And it was basically the lab for the nation and for the world for more than
50
half
years.
a century.
Yeah, definitely.
We still hope for the best in the future of the Bell Labs. And actually, part of the reason why I went to China 18 months ago to join China Mobile was with the hope that we can establish something of similar culture and capability in the long run, having China Mobile as a platform. And in a way, I think the old-fashioned Bell Lab, especially the Bell Lab research environment, was precious, was a gem, but it was made possible because of the financial prowess of AT&T in the old days.
Yeah.
And would you say that nowadays, Google could be the next, while a large corporation, we understand that, is it called Google X or something? Their lab is doing not just networking and software. They are looking at the physics, material science, a lot of fundamental stuff. So is that the next wave, you think?
It could be, and that's a very good observation. I think you're absolutely right that Bell Labs was funded on essentially the monopolistic position of AT&T, which allowed it to generate profits that it could channel into that kind of thing. In the UK, we had something very similar. BT Labs was renowned as being one of the major labs, and again, was possible because BT was a company which made enough profit to do that. And what we've seen, of course, is that those companies have made less profit, they've cut back on that. So I think you're right to pick up on companies that are making large profits, that they could invest in research. And Google does seem to be doing just that with Google Glass, the obvious current example, but you could look back at Google Earth and all these other kind of things that they've done. So I think that's entirely fair, that there may well be one or two of those companies that could continue to do that. Of course, Google was a startup not too long ago. Yeah, every company was at some point, yes. Yeah.
Okay, Bengt?
To link into the question of innovation, on the other side, as Schumpeter says, the creative destruction.
Yes.
So what is the creative destruction that is necessary in order to things to happen? Is the operator in crisis, or any other ideas for things to really get moving in the direction you are pinpointing here?
Oh, I think we're seeing lots of creative destruction or just general destruction in the telecoms area at the moment. I mean, certainly, if you look at infrastructure manufacturers in Europe, many of those have either folded completely or at least are a tiny shadow of their former selves. Even in mobile operators, we're seeing consolidation. In the UK, we had the merger of Orange and T-Mobile to form Everything Everywhere not too long ago. We've seen US operators trying to consolidate and then being prevented from doing so by regulators. There seems to be, to me, a trend in general of that happening, and I think we'll see more operators consolidating and falling out of that picture. So it does seem that destruction is now starting to happen, and that's a terrible sadness for those involved in it, but I think it's partly necessary to encourage the next wave of innovation.
Ray?
Hi. So on your point about startup companies being where the innovation is, isn't there a chicken and egg problem? Where do the innovators come from? They have to come from a funded place such as a university or a Bell Labs type place which is going down. If you don't have that, then how will that system be sustainable?
There is some truth in that a lot of startups are started up by people who leave large organizations, either voluntarily or because they collapse. Certainly the world of the Cambridge cluster that I know very well is forever being refreshed by companies spinning out of others, in some cases because they collapse. So there's an example of a company called TTP.com that Motorola bought and messed up badly, and that spun off lots of other companies. But there's also examples simply of people moving away. So the company I'm with was actually founded predominantly by people from a chipset company called Cambridge Silicon Radio, CSR, which is the world's biggest Bluetooth chipset company, which is actually doing incredibly well. But the people left not because the company folded, but because they were entrepreneurs and they got fed up with being in a company that was growing and decided to leave. So I think there's multiple sources of that. But it does come back to the point about destruction. Actually, destruction in itself can liberate people that go on and do other things and innovate. Yeah, that's a good point.
Mikko?
Yeah, I don't think that this innovation is at all linked to the size of the organization, and you also yourself mentioned that 10% of the SMEs are only successful, so it's I wouldn't call that then the kind of concept of a startup or SME is very successful as such in a way. And also I would rather say that changing anything is difficult, and then for big organizations they need a kind of there is a fair amount of ideas that can cause them to really change what they are doing. And for a startup to change what they are doing doesn't require very much. So somebody is having lunch with somebody and getting a new idea, and the next day startup is something else. Yeah. And so for big companies that requires something more.
Yeah, and I'm not saying there is no role for big companies at all. Big companies are essential, I think, in this whole process to acquire startups, because there are certain things that you just can't do as a startup, really. You need either the economies of a big company, or you need the brand awareness that persuades people to buy it. I mean, as a case in point, our technology could be used for smart metering, and we would never convince the UK government to buy a smart metering network from a company that's only been in existence 2 years. But Vodafone could sell to the UK government, and they could sell our technology. So you just need a brand in some cases to do that. So I think big companies are essential, and I think you're right that big companies have to be more stable. You can't take a big company and suddenly change it overnight. It's just not possible. It's too disruptive. The shareholders wouldn't like it. So they do need to wait until ideas are more settled. So I think actually small companies are a great way to generate ideas. Most of them will fail, but that's life. And then the big companies can wait until they see the successes and then decide whether they want to adopt those through acquisition or something like that.
Okay, maybe the 10% success rate is something that really gets you new innovation. Rather, a big company cannot take those chances of 10% success rate. But now it's Ronaldo's. And then Misha, you have the chance.
So perhaps the speaker knows more about my future employment careers that I do, but all credit to him.
I don't.
However, I will take exception to the statements being made here, and I think we are being a little frivolous and superficial and creating a really false dichotomy. I don't think there is any comparison between what a startup does, and we're kind of a little bit adolescent enamored with the Silicon Valley model. This is really about execution and delivery to the market. It's not about true new concepts. And let's put aside Bell Labs, is a little too personal. The mouse, the Steve Jobs, star, glamour. But let's take a little step away from Hollywood, and let's look at the facts. The mouse was invented by Xerox Parks.
Yep.
The iPhone is a GSM phone. So he's excellent at packaging, marketing, and distribution. If you want to call that innovation, certainly it is, but it's not in the area of hardcore cellular air interface physical layer. And I think this meeting is mostly about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fair point. And different people have different views of what innovation is. And of course, innovation could be anything. It could be.
So Misha has the last word of this discussion, and we'll move on to the next talk. So.
It could be a bit of software.
Just to follow up on the startup issue, now talking to people from two very big companies here. So I agree with Ronaldo. The main problem is not the idea. The main problem is to execute the idea. And you know that pretty well, William. Now, actually, I wanted to comment on your general statistic of 10%. I think that's a myth. Actually, I mean, running a startup is not a digital thing. It's more like you have more like to look at the CDF over years. So I've just seen the statistics today in the morning. So after 3 years in Europe, 65% of the startups are still alive. And they're then probably not any more startups, they're just SMEs. Yeah. So this is 3 years paying people salary so they can feed their family. I don't think that's a failure. Okay, after 10 years, maybe it's not 65%, it's much lower, I agree, it's like 20, it's not 10, but it's, it's not 65. But over this lifespan, 3, 4, 5 years, you have been giving people, work, paycheck, etc. And as times go, I think the coherence time even of your job at Nokia Siemens Network is maybe not even 3 years. We don't know. So I'm just saying, it's not such a big failure to see startups, in terms of a digital thing. It's much more behind that.
Okay, so I think we have to wrap it up at this moment. They have plenty of time to discuss also in the panel sessions, and we thank William once more.
You're welcome.